Hi, folks. What a privilege to be back at ALEC. Ed, you stole my line. The free market works. I feel like I can sit down. That's what I wanted to talk about this afternoon. First, a couple of just quick things. Ron Cheverly, you are my hero. What you've done for ALEC over the last 4 or 5 years has just been sensational. You were the one who really, worked with Jonathan and myself and Art Laffer on Rich States, Poor States, which has been such a success for ALEC, and I just so much appreciate the incredible work that you've done at ALEC. So let's give Ron one more round of applause. What a superstar. I am so, it was the morning of the 4th of July, and I was reading my email, and I got an email from one of my best friends, and it was from Lisa Nelson, and she said, I just took a job to be the executive director at ALEC, and I almost just fell off my chair. I was so pleased. You have got a superstar coming in, an A++ pick, and I want to just give a salute to the people on the selection committee. You could have not picked a better person to run this great organization, and the best is yet to come for ALEC. So congratulations on that great choice. I was working out this morning before the breakfast, and so I was on the Stairmaster, and I was watching C-SPAN. I'm kind of a political junkie, and I don't know how many of you saw this, but this morning the president was at some school. I think he was in Pennsylvania. I wasn't sure what state he was in, and he was talking to a bunch of teachers, and he was talking to some of the young kids in this classroom. It was kind of a summer school class. And did any of you see this? And he was talking to the teachers, gave his kind of standard stump speech, and then amazingly, he said, well, I want to maybe take a few questions from the children. And so I listened up. I had to hear this. And so he said, do any of the children have any questions? And these kids looked like they were about 10, 11, 12 years old. And this little boy in the front of the room is kind of wildly waving his hand. And the president says, yes, young man, what is your name? He says, well, Mr. President, my name is Oliver. And he said, well, Oliver, what is your question? And he said, well, Mr. President, I just wanted to ask you, I just was wondering, Mr. President, do you have any regrets about what happened in Benghazi? And he said, do you think maybe you should have acted a little more quickly, and maybe you could have saved the lives of our ambassador and the other embassy personnel? And you're looking at President Obama, and he's kind of straightening out his eyes, taken aback by this. And then this little boy says, and by the way, Mr. President, I just had one other question, if I may. You had said my parents just lost their health insurance, and you told the Americans that if you liked the health insurance you had, you'd get to keep it. And I'm just wondering, do you think that you were telling the truth to people like my parents? Well, President Obama, I mean, you can see him. He's seldom speechless, right? But he has you could tell he doesn't know how he's going to respond to this. And right when he's about to open his mouth, the recess bell rang, and all the kids scrambled outside, and sure enough, like 10 or 15 minutes later, they come back in, and President Obama is still there. And he says, yes, where was I? Oh, yes, I was taking some questions from the children. Are there any questions? Well, this adorable little girl in the front of the room, this little blonde-haired girl, she raised her hand. Young lady, what's your name? Well, my name is Grace, Mr. President. Well, Grace, what's your question? She says, well, I just have 2 questions this morning, Mr. President. First of all, why did the recess bell go off 15 minutes early this morning? And my second question, Mr. President, is, what the hell happened to Oliver? That's called executive privilege, right? Anyway, my task today is give you a little bit of just an economic primer, and give you some of the lessons that we've learned, Jonathan and myself and Art Laffer and Travis Brown, who's a co-author of our book on the wealth of states, just a kind of little primer about what's going on with the economy. I mean, Ed, you nailed it, that the free market system is what creates the growth and creates the prosperity of this great country of ours. I'm going to kind of keep it slow. This is not rocket surgery, but there may be some people who somehow got into this room from NCSL, so I want to keep it very simple. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some of kind of the important lessons of what's going on with our U.S. economy, and I'm going to start with this. This is kind of an incredible story about what's happening with the U.S. economy right now, and that is, if you look at the red line on this chart, you can see that that's all non-farm income outside of the energy industry. And what's remarkable about that is that we're just about right where we were in terms of production back 5 years ago. And so much so that without the oil and gas industry, without the energy industry, there would be no recovery at all today. We would still essentially be in a recession. And then you look at that blue line and you see the amazing energy revolution that is going on in this country, which is the biggest energy boom in the history of the United States of America. And it is just something to behold. I know, I did this last year, but I want to ask again. Who here, well, first of all, who in this room knows what state in the United States has the lowest unemployment rate? What is it? North Dakota. How many North Dakotans? Anybody here from North Dakota? Where's the North Dakota table? Here you are. North Dakota's unemployment rate is officially 2.9%. That's a bald-faced lie. If you go to North Dakota, actually, there are about 15,000 unfilled jobs in North Dakota. They have more jobs than they have people to fill them. And this is happening all over the country. It's happening in Oklahoma. It's happening in Texas. Texas has tripled their oil and gas output over the last 5 or 6 years. It's happening in West Virginia. It's happening in Pennsylvania. It's a great, great, great story. And what's so amazing about this, I mean, people, so much so that I always tell people in the oil and gas industry, you know, you're the people who re-elected Barack Obama. You know, because without the oil and gas boom, there's no way that Barack Obama would have been re-elected. And yet what's interesting about this, I'm always asked whenever I give a speech about the economy, and in fact, when I spoke here last year, a lot of you came up to me afterwards and said, why is President Obama doing all these crazy things on the economy? Is he, you know, why is he raising taxes? Why is he regulating? Why did he pass Obamacare? Is he intentionally trying to hurt the economy? And I've always said, you know, consistently for 6 years, he's not intentionally trying to hurt the economy. This is a president who just doesn't really understand. His antenna just doesn't pick up these messages that we're talking about, but he doesn't have any kind of sinister motives. But I have to say this, that when I saw what happened 2 or 3 months ago with the new EPA regulations, you're familiar with these new carbon emissions, these are craziness. He is basically looking at this industry that you see that is exploding, that is creating so many jobs in America, and he is trying to stick a knife right in the back of the industry that's creating the wealth. Why? Why would they do that? Any of you, raise your hand if any of you saw the movie, have seen the new movie Planet of the Apes. How many of you have seen it? Some of you have. I went to see it with my kids last week. An interesting scene in that movie. The little colonies of humans are being overtaken by a planet of apes. And it's very interesting. You know what the humans don't have access to? Electric power, electricity. And so they can't function. They don't have heat, they don't have light, they can't produce anything, and so on. And it's I wrote a column on this last week that this is what the environmentalists want to do to us. They essentially, if we move forward with these kind of these regulations that President Obama is talking about, this is no exaggeration. If we shut down coal and we continue to go after our oil and gas industry, ladies and gentlemen, the lights will go out. We will have brownouts in this country. We will have blackouts in this country. And it is a very serious challenge that we face in this regard. It's very interesting. There was a meeting last week, just to give you a sense of what we're up against. There was a meeting of the major environmental groups across the country over the last, that met last weekend, about 150 of these organizations. And by the way, every one of us in this room is an environmentalist. Right? Every one of us wants clean air. We want clean water. We want to protect open spaces. We want to protect the tigers and polar bears and pandas and things like that. But this was not their agenda. What the statement that these 150 environmentalists put out last weekend said this, that the enemy of the environment is the capitalist system. And we have to end the capitalist system if we are going to survive as a planet. Now, I would submit to you that when people say that, they are crazy. They are dangerous, right? There's an old saying that, kind of a new saying, that the Greens are the new Reds. And it's really true. These are people who are trying to very directly go after our economy in an extremely negative and very dangerous way. Now, I want to show you one other quick thing. So they say, well, we're going to use renewables. I don't have anything against renewables, but look at the second panel here. Renewables has been up a little bit over the last 5, 6, 7 years, despite spending $100 billion in subsidies. Look at what's happening in oil and gas. Ladies and gentlemen, today, I think most of you know the answer to this, but when I ask most audiences, they have no idea. I always ask people, what percentage of our electricity today comes from wind and solar power, the renewables? Anybody know the answer to that? It's less than 3%. We're up to 2.7%. Where do we get our electricity from? We get our electricity from oil, from gas, from coal, from nuclear power, from hydropower. Every source of power that the environmentalists are against, that's where we get our power from. What I'm saying to you is the renewable energy standards that are passing in a lot of these states are raising the price of electricity and they're like a regressive tax on poor people and people in the middle class. Next point I want to make, and I think this is an important one. I try to crystallize why is it that our ideas are so much more effective and so much more successful than the ideas of the left, the Reagan ideas versus what I call the Obama ideas. And I think this chart kind of crystallizes what is going on. This is what I call the growth gap. And it's interesting, if you look over the last 35 or 40 years, we've had an interesting natural experiment. We've had two presidents who have come into office during great economic crises. President Ronald Reagan came into, how many of you remember 20% mortgage interest rates and 14% inflation and all of that stuff that we had under Jimmy Carter? The economy was deindustrializing under Reagan, and of course, we all remember what happened in 2008. The economy just imploded, and we had a sinkage of the stock market, and the banking industry collapsed, and so on. And as President Obama always says, I walked into office when we had lost 5 million jobs. He's exactly right. He inherited an economic mess, too. So these two presidents walk into the White House in a terrible economic crisis situation. And what they did in terms of dealing with that crisis was diametrically opposite approaches. So what did Ronald Reagan do? You know this. He cut tax rates. He got government spending under control. He deregulated key industries. He let the supply side of the economy, the private industry, grow us out of this terrible malaise that we were in the 1970s. President Obama came in and did exactly the opposite. We had huge tax increases on the rich. We had the $830 billion stimulus plan. We had cash for clunkers. We had one failed program after another, Obamacare, all of these things which were exactly the opposite approach. We had the massive infusion of money into the economy, and now we look at the results. And by the way, you all know that, probably all of you have heard, the GDP numbers came out this morning. We had a good number, a really good number for GDP. For the second quarter, it was 4%. But even taking into account that number, because remember, we lost 2% of GDP in the first quarter, those aren't really that great performance. And if you look at this, what this is saying is that the growth gap today is very close to $2 trillion. And just to keep this very simple, what I'm saying is if the economy had grown as fast under Barack Obama in this recovery as it did under the Reagan recovery, we would have $2 trillion more GDP. That's a big number. If we were to distribute that money evenly to every family in America, that would be a $10,000 to $15,000 raise for every family. And meanwhile, you know this, and this is the thing, this is, I think, the great cancer in our economy right now. Middle-income families are not seeing wage and salary growth. It has not happened. In fact, the average family today in America has $1,500 less income adjusted for inflation than they did when the recession ended. That's never happened before. As far as I've looked at the last 9 recessions, usually you see incomes rising steadily to make up for the ground that was lost during the recession. We haven't seen that. And that is the middle class squeeze and anxiety that you're all seeing in your states. Now, I want to show you something else which is pertinent to what's happening at ALEC. And this is really, Jonathan and I and others have put this together, and I think this really summarizes what Rich States, Poor States is all about. And the book that I wrote with Travis Brown and Art Laffer and others, which is this, that states that have low taxes and states that are essentially red states, and I'm not saying red states as Republican as much as red states that are promoting free market policies, are doing much better than blue states, and blue states are states that are adopting sort of the Obama agenda of higher tax rates, higher minimum wages, all of these kind of these interventions into the marketplace. And this is kind of a stunning chart, I believe, because what it's showing you, and this is the other kind of neat natural experiment that we have that validates the model that we all espouse, which is that free markets work. And so this is over the last 15 years or so, just showing job growth. And the great thing about this is that we have 4 states in the United States that account for almost a third of the population. Texas, Florida, California, and New York. Those are gigantic states with huge numbers of people. And what's amazing about this is look at the results. Texas has had 3 times the job growth of California. Florida has had 5 times the growth rate of New York. Now, how do you explain that? If you're a liberal, how do you explain those numbers? And I've debated this with liberals all the time, and they have no response to this. They have no response. By the way, Texas and Florida have a gigantic advantage over California and New York. What is the income tax rate in Texas and Florida? 0. What is the California and New York tax rate? It's 13%. It's 13%. That's a gigantic advantage that you have if you're located in Texas and Florida. Now, I debated, do you all know Paul Krugman? Do you all know who Paul Krugman is? He's the left-wing writer for the New York Times, and he's someone that almost every liberal listens to. And I was debating him on this subject, and I showed him this chart, and I said, Paul, explain this to me. If your model works so well, why are Texas and Florida kicking the butt of California and New York? And I was very eager to hear his explanation for this. And you know what he said? He got up and said, Steve, there's a very good explanation for this. It's the weather. It's the weather. That's why people are moving to these southern states. And, I just zinged him, I have to say. I mean, one of my proudest moments. So I got up after he made his point, and I said, Paul, that's an interesting observation, that this weather. And I said, there's no question that if you live in Illinois or, if you live in Wisconsin or Minnesota, and you're going to move to Fort Lauderdale, a lot of people do move for the weather. There's no question about that. But I said, Paul, explain this to me. If this is all being driven by weather, explain to me why people are leaving San Diego and going to Houston, because they're not going from San Diego to Houston for the weather. Right? And he was like, blah, blah, blah. He had no response to this whatsoever, because there is no response. Now I want to show you something else about this. This is from our latest version. I believe this is the latest version of Rich States, Poor States, which, Jonathan, I think you said will be out next month. And this is basically showing you our kind of forecast of which states are doing the right things and which states are doing the wrong things. And it's just interesting, isn't it? Look at the states that are at the top: Utah, South Dakota, Indiana, North Dakota, Idaho, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Wyoming. Now, one of the things, how many Hoosiers are there in this room? How many Indianas? I think, Jonathan, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, hasn't Indiana made more progress in the last 7 years than any state? So you've moved. I think when we started, Indiana was ranked somewhere in the middle of the pack or below the middle, and because of great leadership of Mitch Daniels and now the great Mike Pence, who could and should be the next president of the United States, because of their leadership, Indiana has moved way up in the rankings. And then, I hate to say this, but look at the states at the bottom. Look at these states: New Jersey, Minnesota, California, Illinois, Vermont. I mean, these are states that are just bleeding jobs. I'm from Illinois. I hate to see this. I hate to see what's happening in my home state. But they just don't get it right. These are states that completely get it wrong. One of the things that we've been working at ALEC, and this is kind of one of my missions in life, for those of you who are from the South, the great story about what's happening in America today is that there is a great migration of jobs and capital and people from the Northeast to the South. It is indisputable that this is happening, and the center of power, economically and politically, is shifting southward. And by the way, I was out in Mississippi a few weeks ago, talking about this, and I said, and the South will rise again. And these people in the audience said, do you mean militarily? I said, no, not militarily. but here's my vision. And for those of you who are from Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana and North Carolina and South Carolina and states like that, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing in America if we could do this? If within 5 or 10 years we could make the South, every state of the Mason-Dixon line, a no-income tax state. Wouldn't that be something? I mean, wouldn't it be amazing if that entire region, because we've already got Texas, Tennessee, and Florida, right? And those are states that are growing at an incredibly rapid pace. So this is what we're charged with at ALEC, to make every state a growth state by reducing their taxes, becoming more efficient. Now, I want to show you this because it's something some of you have seen before, but it is so important. Tax rates matter, right? The green line here is just the top income tax rate in the United States over the last 50 years. And Ed, you were talking about this issue of income inequality, which keeps coming up in all of the debates in Washington. And so what the response by the left is raise taxes on the rich. You know, we're going to reduce income inequality by soaking the rich. And if you look at this chart, it's so interesting because the green line is the top tax rate. We went from 70% to 50% down to 28% under Reagan. You can see that very steep decline in tax rates, and then they've climbed up a little bit, but not so much. We're at about a 35 to 40% rate today. And then look at the share. That brown line is the share of taxes paid by the rich, the richest 1%. Now this is an amazing chart, isn't it? As the tax rates on the rich have come down, the share of taxes paid by the rich have gone up. Amazing, right? An amazing story. How do you explain that? It's because the economy grew when the burden of these taxes fell. I read this every time I come to ALEC, so please bear with me because I think it's one of the most profound quotes in American history, and it's something, you know, we just have to keep drilling into people's head. It comes from John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, almost exactly 50 years ago. It is a paradoxical truth. Tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low. The soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the rates now. Wow. What an incredible insight. Now I want to show you one other thing that's related to this. We're going to skip that one because I'm running out of time. This is a crisis that is going on right now as we speak in America about what is happening with our corporate income tax. How many of you in the last 3 or 4 weeks have heard the term inversion? How many of you heard about this? If you haven't been following this, this is a crisis that is going on in our country. American companies are renouncing their U.S. citizenship and they're leaving this country. We're seeing this, Pfizer threatened to do it a couple of months ago. These are iconic American companies. Medtronic, which is one of our major healthcare companies. Walgreens in Illinois is now talking about leaving. There are about 5 or 10 other major Fortune 100 companies that are talking about leaving the United States. Now, why are they doing that? Why would they leave? This chart shows you the answer. Look at what has happened with that dotted line is the U.S. corporate tax rate. We're at 40% or so when you take into account the local, state and local taxes. Look at the rest of the world. Look what the rest of the world has been doing over the last 20 years or so. They are very aggressively cutting their tax rates. Every month almost you see some countries, Spain, Ireland, England, just the other day, Japan cut their corporate tax rate. So now we've gone from a country that had a corporate tax rate that was about the international average. Now we are something like 15 to 20 percentage points above the international average. Now I debate liberals on this issue every day, and they say tax rates don't matter. Yes, they do matter, and this shows why, because what's happening now is companies are leaving the United States and they are going to these other countries like Ireland where you can pay 12.5% rather than 40% in the United States. This is a travesty. The way I've written about this is it is unpatriotic. It is unpatriotic for us to have a 35% corporate tax rate. American workers are being damaged and harmed by this corporate tax system. And by the way, for those of you who live in states like Illinois, like California, like New Jersey, like New York, you're doing the same thing. You're adding insult to injury by adding onto that burden, making it 40 to 45%. The most expensive place to do business in the world today with respect to taxes is now California, Illinois, New York, and New Jersey. Why would we do that? I mean, why would we? This is like putting a tariff on our own goods and services. I call it a Head Start program for every country that America competes with. Why would we do something like this? It is incumbent upon us to get this tax rate down as low as possible. I want to suggest to you a radical proposal. Let's get rid in every state and in Washington, D.C., let's get rid of the corporate income tax. Let's just get rid of it and make America a place where companies want to come, not where people want to leave. I mean, I think this is, by the way, we're going to see more and more of these inversions. By the way, the president's proposal is, you know what the president wants to do about this? He doesn't want to fix the corporate tax system. He basically wants to make it illegal for companies to leave. Now look, if you cut me, I bleed red, white, and blue. I love this country. I hate to see it when an American company leaves this country and sends jobs abroad. I hate that. But this is happening because of the tax system. So what the president wants to do is basically chain down their desks and handcuff people to their doors so they can't leave. You know, the way I put this when I testified before Congress last week on this, it's like you've got a burning building and the president's proposal is to lock the doors so nobody can get out. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. You know, this is Obama's tax system, right? How much money did you make? Send it in. You know, I mean, that's how can it get you know, much simpler than that? I mean, this is only a slight exaggeration. A couple of last points I want to make, and then I will let you all go to your next session. I want to just show you a couple of other quick things I think are important. You know, you all talked about what's happened to auto prices. I mean, this is a great story about American efficiency. American companies have become so hyper efficient that the average if you look at this, the average automobile today is actually cheaper today than it was 10 years ago. That's amazing. Prices are falling for most consumer items like cars and trucks, like apparel, like software, like computers. Now, here's what's really interesting. And again, some of you heard me, you know, talk about this before, but I think it's such an important thing to remember. Look at the industries where prices are out of control in America over the last 10 to 15 years. Education and healthcare. Education and healthcare. What do those two industries have in common? Those are the two industries that are most dominated by government. Is this an accident? I don't think so. President Obama said when we created Obamacare, it was going to, remember, it's going to turn the cost curve down at healthcare. Well, Mr. President, when has that ever happened? When has that ever happened? I believe if we had a free market system in healthcare, we would see prices declining in healthcare, not rising. And education, my God, I mean, what's happening with education costs is near criminal. It's near criminal. I have 2 kids in college. Some of you heard me, you know, go off on this, but it just makes me so angry. My oldest son goes to Northwestern, just graduated. I paid $62,500 a year. That's thievery. That's stealing. You know, by the way, I paid $200,000 for that diploma. I don't know if you saw this in the newspapers. They misspelled everything on the diploma. I want my money back. You know, I mean, it's unbelievable what you're getting for your money. I think one of the things I'd love to see ALEC do, and I know you're leaders in this area, is we have got to blow the lid off the cover of the biggest scam in America today is higher education. It is a scam, and it is stealing from American parents. And what you can do, and this is simply a result of the fact that there is no transparency, there's no supervision. State after state just keeps sending money to these schools without any kind of obligation on the part of the schools to control their costs. The good news is, you know what? The jig is up on this. You know why the jig is up on these higher education costs? What's going to blow the lid off of this? The internet. The internet. You can now get a first-rate college education for 1/20th of the cost through the internet than you can with these elite schools. It's an amazing thing. I think I'm going to stop there. I want to make one other quick point, if I may. One of the big issues that we've been working on at Heritage, and I think this is an issue in almost every one of your states, is the issue of the minimum wage. I mean, raise your hand if this is something that's come up as a big issue in your state. I think most of you are seeing this as a major challenge. Now, look, I want American workers to be the highest paid workers in the world. I'm for higher wages. We're all for that. We want wages and salaries to go up in this country so that we have a middle class, as you said, sir, that is rising up the income ladder. That's what America is about. But but raising the minimum wage is about the dumbest possible way to try to achieve that. It is about the dumbest idea there is. Now, one of the things that if you look at the data on the minimum wage, by the way, and we've been doing a lot of research on this at Heritage, as most of you know, this is common sense. Who earns the minimum wage in America today? Teenagers do. Young people do. Over half of the people who earn the minimum wage are under the age of 23. These are starter jobs. These are the first jobs that people will have in their career. I'll give you an indication of how old I am. My first job, I earned $2.30 an hour working in a warehouse outside of Chicago, Illinois. And you know what? How many of you, your first job was a minimum wage job? Raise your hand. Most of you in this room. I look back at that. I would really make the serious case that one of the most important jobs I ever had was my first job. right? That's when you learn to show up. You learn life skills. You learn you better be courteous to your boss. You learn that you better show up on time. You learn that you better be productive. You know, you learn that you better how to run a cash register. You learn that you better be courteous to the customers. Those kinds of things matter. And if we raise the minimum wage, and we've done some studies on this, my colleague Joel Griffin is here, we're showing very clearly that what happens when you raise the minimum wage is the teenage unemployment rate goes way up. You're pricing people out of their first jobs. And that is about as harmful a thing as you can do. Because if you don't have your first job, you can't get the second job. And if you can't get the second job, you can't get the third. Why would we want to do that? Now, I want to make a proposal. I hate raising the minimum wage. I don't think any state should raise the minimum wage. But if you're in a blue state or a purple state where there's pressure to raise the minimum wage, one of the things I would suggest to you all, and we should do this at the federal level as well. How many of you agree with me? At least we should have a teenage minimum wage of $5 or $6 an hour so that everybody can get a job. You know, look, I always tell people, I have 2 teenage sons. I don't always like them, but I love them. And the thing about my 2 teenage sons, I love them, but I would never pay them $10 an hour. I would never pay them $10 an hour. You know, please, somebody hire them for $5 or $6 or $7 an hour. And that's the way it is with most teenagers. They don't know anything, but they're going to learn a lot on those first jobs. So that's one of the things I hope that you will consider. We ought to have a teenage minimum wage for young people, and that would go a long way to solving this problem. I see my time is up. I want to just simply say this. Ed, you really did nail it. This is not a complicated formula. If you look at the states where the growth of the economy is, it is in Texas, it is in Florida, it is in Tennessee, it is in New Hampshire, it is in Arizona, it is in Utah. And those are the states that get it right. And our challenge is not to make America look like New York, but to make America look like Texas. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.